All right, y'all. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us in this conversation on the Socialist Reconstruction, a better future for a socialist future. My name is Kym Smith, and I am the organizer with the Party for Socialism for Liberation. I'm also a co-founder of the Soda City Bail Fund, an organizer with Safe and Healthy South Carolina, and outside liaison with Jailhouse Lawyers Speak South Carolina. So once again, welcome. This webinar is being organized by the Party for Socialism and Liberation. We are an anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist organization dedicated to fighting for the liberation of all working class and marginalized people here and abroad. And it is with immense excitement that we take this opportunity to share our vision for a socialist future, particularly as it relates to the United States. We've been taught to believe that there is a greater chance we will see the end of the world before we ever see the end of capitalism. Lies. This book does a great job at inviting readers to imagine, not loosely, but concretely, on the necessity and possibilities of building socialism in this country. The significance of a socialist reconstruction in the belly of the beast is of the utmost hugest significance, not only to the poor and working class in this country, but also to the poor and working class globally. To speak more on this and the proposals found in this book, we have some amazing guests that I'm honored to be in conversation with tonight. I want to introduce you to each one, and then we're going to start with some questions and just get the conversation going. So we have the contributors to the book, Jodi Dean and Ben Becker. Jodi Dean is a political theorist, author, organizer, and professor at Hobart and William Smith Colleges in New York State. She is also an active member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Ben Becker is a founding member and part of the Central Committee of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. He is editor-in-chief of Breakthrough News, an organizer, and an educator. Vijay Prashad is a Marxist historian, executive director of TriContinental Institute for Social Research, and part of the International People's Assembly, an international process of over 200 organizations, social movements, and political organizations working together to advance the interests of the working class globally. So first of all, welcome everyone. And I just wanted to kick off this conversation really quick, just jump into Ben to share some of the thinking behind the book, its purpose, and what are some of the key objectives?
While I was muted, we got lots of, look, I didn't have mine. I don't have my prop. Everyone needs a prop now. Herschel Walker has told us. So thank you, Kym, and thank you all the friends and comrades who are joining us either on social media, on YouTube, here in the Zoom webinar. I see we have about 400 people on the webinar, which is great. It's just the way we want to start off this book launch, to not just be the release of a book, but the beginning of a large conversation, a dialogue among the left in particular, but hopefully with ever larger sections of the working class in the United States and in the world. To your question, Kym, the book really derives from a quite a lengthy internal discussion that we had inside the PSL for a couple years. And I want to just give you a taste of what that discussion was, because I think that helps explain, why we felt a book like this was necessary and why we took so much time writing it and revising it and talking about it. And it was quite a, deliberative process, I would say, to put a book like this out. The book comes, I would say, at a very unique moment in US history. When you think about how socialism has gone from basically the unofficial religion, anti-communism rather, has gone from the unofficial religion of the United States for so many decades to now being a word that is being searched, discussed, debated among tens of millions of people. And we saw this in the Bernie Sanders movement in particular, but really it began before that, when the Republicans started attacking socialism so much, calling even things like a Republican healthcare plan socialistic, which was what Obamacare was. But by being so critical of socialism from the right, they actually started to renew people's interest in socialism. Like, wow, well, if a Medicaid expansion is socialism, maybe I am a socialist. And then this continued in the Occupy movement, where there was a broad anti-capitalist sentiment, and then the Bernie Sanders movement, which I would say reintroduced the word socialism to many millions of people, especially young people, actually in a more favorable way. And even when the right wing started to attack Bernie Sanders as a socialist, something different happened there compared to previous times where, for instance, Obama ran away from the socialist label because Bernie himself had identified like that for so long. He couldn't exactly run away from it, but it didn't stick. The masses of people who were supporting the Bernie Sanders campaign did not run away just because he was being called a socialist. It actually started to increase curiosity and interest in what socialism actually is. And so now you have, among really millions of people, a broad acceptance and even an identification with the word socialism, with the concept of socialism, but really lacking definition, really lacking clarity about what socialism is. What is the political project of socialism? What could it look like? Bernie Sanders, of course, put forward his own, I would say, very mild definition of socialism, which is really associating it with kind of social democratic reforms. And while we had criticisms of Bernie Sanders' policies, especially his international, his foreign policy, we recognized that the positive element in his campaign, which was that it was reintroducing many of those reforms, which would indeed be great steps forward for the working class, the exploited, the oppressed, to have universal health care, the end of student debt, universal education, many other things, which really are quite elementary just for the quality of life of humanity, that are only considered radical and controversial in the United States. But in any case, it started a conversation in society about how do we define socialism. So on one hand, we wanted to engage with that debate, engage with that discussion with a perspective about what socialism means to us. And it's not just the introduction of certain reforms, redistribution, it's not just taxing the billionaires a little bit more. It's not just relieving some of the worst abuses, but fundamentally changing who holds power in society. Society without billionaires and actually without capitalist owners and landlords. And so that's one element of the book. The other thing, which I think speaks to why we put out this book now, in the United States, there's no lack of struggle. There's no absence of struggle. The idea that the whole US population is complacent or something like that, which sometimes you hear more cynical people advance, that the exploitation and oppression that characterizes so much of our society is just broadly accepted. That's not true. We've actually seen huge struggles in the United States, massive struggles. Some of the biggest struggles in history have happened in the last 20 years, the last 18 years since the PSL was founded. A lot of us, that's where we cut our teeth, all as organizers, not as writers or dreamers of the socialist future, but in the immigrant rights movement, in the Black Lives Matter movement, in the anti-war movement, organizing low-wage workers. There's so many important and significant struggles. But what we recognize as the key challenge, the ideological challenge, before I spoke about the opportunity, the big ideological challenge of our left, of our movement in this country, is that we are carrying with us the baggage of so much anti-communist indoctrination. So this idea that another future is possible and it's concrete, that the working class can hold power, all of these concepts have been so diminished, so discredited. And not just by the right wing, but even sectors of the left, the NGO, the people who actually are part of the resistance movement, and all these resistance movements haven't been able to really articulate what it would look like to have a different society. It's one thing to say another world is possible and we want a world without X, Y, or Z injustice. But what does that actually look like? Could it actually be achieved? And how could the working class really reorganize all of society? What would another mode of production, let's say, look like in the United States? And there's a lot of reasons why people have put aside that question or have said that this is purely utopian or impossible. For some, it's the fear of the state. For some, they think the capitalists are simply too strong. They think people are too indoctrinated. But there's also, or they think class unity is impossible. There's many reasons why. But the main point is that people have sort of taken it off the table, that all we can do is resist. We can't actually make a new society. And we came to the conclusion that was, unless we provide, in a way, a blueprint of what it could look like here, unless we give people something to fight for, that people won't ever really be able to sink their teeth into what socialism is. And in fact, if you don't have a positive program of what you're fighting for, and you can see it, you can taste it, you can feel it, then in fact, you'll burn out. You'll go from resistance struggle to resistance struggle. But ultimately, unless you have that grounding in what you're fighting for, it'll over time start to feel like it's not going anywhere. It's just up and down and up and down, struggle and repression, struggle and repression. And what we're saying is that there is a way out of that cycle of struggle and repression, and that's by having a socialist United States. And the other aspect that is so important is that in that ideological battle, the main way that they get people to not believe in socialism is they compare it to the countries that have had socialist revolutions under conditions of underdevelopment in the global South, or even in the Soviet Union, which was a poor, very poor country when it had its revolution. And they say, well, look at the US average standard of living versus Cuba or Venezuela or the Soviet Union. Now, many of those countries have had amazing achievements, and they've developed things even under blockade, under isolation, under the threat of war, that the whole working class should be proud of and that we defend. But if we accept that framing of the question, well, do you want to live here or do you want to live in Venezuela? We've already ceded too much ground to the imperialists, because the way to compare capitalism to socialism is not to compare capitalist United States to blockaded, embargoed, and oppressed Cuba, dealing with the conditions of colonialism and slavery and all that it's inherited. We say compare the capitalist United States to the socialist United States. And then you actually have an apples to apples comparison of why socialism is in fact the superior system. But of course, we can't just turn on the TV and see a socialist United States. We actually have to sort of create it. We have to show it in practice. This is what it could look like. This is what it will look like, more or less. And that's really why the book was written. That's why we want everyone to buy the book, so that we can start having that debate with people. The person who tells you, you just want to live in X, Y, or Z country. We should fight them about all the propaganda they're fed about those countries, about Cuba, about Venezuela. We should explain why the conditions have been challenging there and why it has to do with imperialism. But we have to be able to hit back and say, no, that's a false comparison. The real question is, why isn't a country that has so many resources, so much technology, so much wealth, why is it that we have tens of millions of people going hungry right here? Why do we have so many people suffering under debt? Why do we have 18 people in Rikers who have died in the last few months in the United States? They want to make a big hue and cry about every person who dies in a country that's targeted by US regime change. But here in New York City, we have people in police custody who are routinely dying. So we want to talk about the horrors of the capitalist present and compare it to really the magnificent achievements that we could have in a socialist future.
All right, Ben, get me fired up on a Wednesday night.
Here we go.
Thank you so much. And I think it's really important and significant to think about all the possibilities that this book offers, because we want to deepen these conversations around not only the necessity of socialism, but the possibility of socialism. We got to remember that this is possible. We will win. So I'm gonna kick it to Jodi. So Jodi, we know that the US has built its empire on war and extraction domestically and internationally. And like when politicians and others speak about the issues of climate change, they do kind of in a way that frame it as a personal responsibility. What do each of us have to individually do to save the planet, right? And not from the perspective of the economic system that has actually caused all of this economic devastation. or they approach it as an issue that has been caused by others in the global South. Not that the global North has created conditions that forces the global South to survive with very few options. The solutions are also not the most conducive to like actually saving the planet and stopping the catastrophe that awaits us. It's drastic measures, like if drastic measures are not taken. So can you kind of share the ideas and proposals that are shared in the books around climate change and how a socialist society would actually approach this issue?
Sure, thanks, Kym. So one of the fundamental premises of the book is that that climate change is an existential threat, right? And capitalism can't address it, right? Capitalism is not going to be able to address the problems of the floods and storms and fires and droughts, and it's not going to be able to address the way that the people who are the least responsible for it are the ones who are shouldering most of the burdens of it, and that is both domestic and international. And we know that capitalism can't solve this problem because capitalism is as much a system of destruction as it is of production, right? It means that, capitalism always, as Walter Rodney taught us, capitalism underdeveloped large parts of the world as it developed Europe. Capitalism prioritizes profits over everything else. And so when anyone starts to say that, oh, well, there can be capitalist measures to climate change, what they really mean is that capitalists will find a way to exploit more people with solutions. What they will call solutions. They will find a way to make more countries in debt in what they call solutions. They will find more ways to let a small ruling class get richer and richer. So we know that capitalism won't be able to solve these problems. Marx also recognized already this destructive aspect of capitalism. In Capital, he said that all progress that capitalist agriculture makes is actually progress in the art, not only of robbing the worker, but of robbing the soil. So that's how capitalists understand their progress. What we'll do is, of course, put the whole matter of environmental damage and climate change in the hands of the working class. And what this will mean in practice is that we will address climate change with three basic mechanisms, right? We will, by decommodifying energy, by decarbonizing energy, and by decolonizing energy. And I'm going to talk a little bit about all three of these. So in some ways, the decommodifying energy is the easiest part. That just means we're going to nationalize the whole energy sector and treat energy as the common resource that it is, rather than as an opportunity for some people to make profit at the expense of everyone else. There is no reason that the resources of the planet, right, things like coal or oil, had to ever be private, but in fact, it was because they were private capitalist benefits that they've actually ended up destroying the planet, rather than being organized or distributed in ways that would actually benefit the vast majority of people. So we're going to first start out by decommodifying all of energy. This will let us very quickly decarbonize our energy sources, and that means the kind of bottom line of that is keeping the fossil fuels in the ground, right? No extraction of oil, no extraction of coal, no fracking. These resources have to be kept in the ground. And at the same time, we have to increase our reliance on wind power and solar power and hydropower, and make sure that we're using these in responsible ways. Now, in the Socialist Reconstruction book, we have a plan that we call Cap and Convert. And the Cap and Convert plan, there's lots of wonderful details that people can chew on. And I won't go into every different organization that we have involved in Cap and Convert. But the basic version is that you can have a 10-year plan that decreases the amount of fossil fuels produced and imported in the US, and increases the amount of renewables that are part of the energy mix. And you can increase decrease the fossil fuel part by 10%, increase the renewable mix by 10%, so that within 5 years, you've got a 50% change, and within 10 years, you've got 100% change, right? So you plan these together, and it means a planned approach to how production is organized, a planned approach to how transportation is organizing, how housing is organized. But you can set these targets, and I'll tell you, it's a lot better than some sort of ridiculous thing like, oh, taxing billionaires, which the billionaires are already able to get basically to keep their money offshore and to avoid taxes. So that's never going to work. Or some sort of strange kinds of carbon taxes. Also, given that can barely be monitored, that's not going to work. What does work is actually stopping producing fossil fuels and keeping the fossil fuels in the ground. So that's the second step of decarbonizing energy. The third step is decolonizing energy. And this is a really important part of PSL's approach to climate change, right? This is not an approach to climate change that you see in most of the national socialist parties, who don't seem to be particularly worried about imperialism and don't seem to be particularly worried about the impacts of climate change on countries, particularly in the global South. But we are concerned with that. So we're following the lead of the People's Agreement made in Cochabamba in 2010, because that agreement requires the countries of the global North to accept the responsibility of their capitalist classes for the devastation that's been wrought on the planet. And so we begin from that, like, yes, the capitalist class in the US bears a primary responsibility for climate change. And so we have to own that. And the next step of owning that is recognizing that we have a responsibility to share technology, not to sell it, right? Not to make countries in debt for their own adaptation projects, but to share the technology we have, to share the skills we have, and to be in conversation and learning from other countries as well, what they think they can do, what they have learned, how they have adapted to change, and then also provide technologies that they think they need. So we need to share knowledge and technology on the grounds not of our benefit, but on, what are the people who are asking for it? What do they want? They set the table, they set the agenda. And so we also need to make sure that we build learning networks, right, globally across the board as part of this climate debt and this climate accountability. So overall, then, our climate approach has these three prongs of decommodification, which means energy is a resource, not a money-making tool. Decarbonization, which means keep it in the ground. And decolonization, which means follow the lead of the People's Agreement from Cochabamba and recognize that imperialist, industrialized countries like the United States bear a primary responsibility for climate change and for redressing it.
Thank you so much for that, Jodi. It's such a desperate need to decolonize, decommodify, and decarbonize energy. And these are easy solutions to climate change. And I really want everybody to remember that we can do this and we will do this. And, this will ultimately cause the global North to assume a responsibility for the catastrophic misery it has caused the global South, which is so important. All right, Vijay. So you do a lot of work towards building working class internationalism and spend a good time with movements all around the world. So can you share your impressions on the book and share some of the connections you see on our building socialism in the US as part of paying our historical debt to the global South?
Well, thanks a lot, Kym. Thanks for inviting me. I'm grateful to the Party for Socialism and Liberation. It's a terrific book. Congratulations, Ben, Jodi, others who participated in constructing it. I think it's an essential book for people to read. And I'm not looking forward merely for people to read this book, but I'd like to see the establishment of the United Socialist States of America. Sounds like a pretty tasty thing to me. And I very much hope that people's movements within the United States will gather together, build some sort of common agenda, and make a push. Let me just make a couple of comments, Kym, about things that I've seen in the news recently that reflect on the urgency of a project like this. You may have seen that ExxonMobil booked quarterly revenues of $112 billion. Things were so grotesque that even old Joe Biden, the president of the United States, had to say ExxonMobil made more money than God. I don't know if you saw this comment he made in August. ExxonMobil made more money than God. Okay, so the question then comes up in the US ruling class, liberal sections of it, no doubt, repeating a discussion in the United Kingdom, again, in liberal sections of the ruling class in the UK. The question comes up of so-called windfall tax, that do you tax the kind of outrageous profits made by energy companies at the time when people are struggling with the cost of living? In the United States, inflation has hit people hard, even though the growth rate is at a level which could manage inflation, but there's so much social inequality that it has hit working people very hard. Well, what about a windfall tax? Sounds like a pretty decent liberal idea. As I say, you don't need to be a socialist to campaign for a windfall tax. Along comes the great intellectuals of the ruling class and say this is a terrible idea. Number one in this gallery of rogues is former US Treasury Secretary under Bill Clinton, Larry Summers. Now, Summers has a history of saying ridiculous things. When he was the chief economist at the World Bank, Summers wrote a memo saying that United States should ship its garbage to Africa because the US has got money. Africa doesn't have money. The US has garbage. Africa doesn't have garbage. So, well, let's just ship the garbage. This was not a modest proposal in the line of Jonathan Swift. This was actually a serious memorandum for discussion. Well, there's a discussion in the liberal wings of the ruling class. What about a windfall tax? Perhaps give people a break with their energy bills as winter sets in because of this war that the US simply will not allow to end in Ukraine. And then comes Larry Summers and he says, well, this is the exact opposite thing to do, because after all, we have to encourage investments, and investment comes when companies, corporations like Exxon make profits. So taking away their profits takes away investment, which is going to hurt people in the long run. This is the level of thinking that the ruling class intellectuals are capable of providing. And for that reason, it's very important to systematize a completely different approach to common sense problems that require common sense solutions. And I want to say something to the people who read this book. I think it's very important to say that this book, this is not a proposal from the left. It's not really a proposal even from the PSL, although the PSL has done the hard work of putting it together. These are common sense proposals that come from people. They have merely been systematized by the left. The left isn't putting proposals into the world. The left is actually mirroring the common sense proposals that are out there in communities, people struggling with bills, people struggling with the commodification of every aspect of their life. They don't want to see water charges rise or electricity bills go up. They want another way forward. And what this book does is it says, well, look, your desires to decommodify parts of life, to make childcare services not affordable but available, to make public transportation not affordable but available. You see, the language of affordable is the language of the ruling class. Why should public transport be affordable? Public transport should be available without payment. It should be decommodified. Why should education be affordable? I dislike the word affordable. We should substitute the word affordable with the word available. Education should be made available to people, not affordable. Affordable is just a smoke and mirrors way of saying, well, we'll take as much as we can from you. So it's very important, I think, for us to acknowledge that the proposals in this book are not proposals that come out of somebody's head. These are common sense arguments for, in fact, problems that the world can overcome. Now, I looked at the Brown University ticker. They study the amount of money that the United States government has spent, the social wealth of the world, really, that the US government has spent on warfare in the post 9/11 wars, and I don't know if people know this, the bill right now is $8 trillion. That's the total bill the US government has spent in its post 9/11 wars, from Afghanistan out to yesterday's drone attack, wherever the US, assassinated somebody illegally. $8 trillion, that is a monumental amount of money. Imagine the what could have been made with those social resources. For instance, transportation systems in the United States are ridiculous. They are so much inferior to transportation systems in many parts of the world. It's actually astounding how car reliant the United States is. United States is an enormous country in land mass. There should be terrific high-speed rail systems to connect people. When people talk about electric cars, I'm actually against electric cars. I'm against private cars. I would like to see more public transportation and less private transportation. Of course, in the short term, you may need electric cars and whatever, but electric cars are not going to solve the problem. If we go from, I don't know, 4 billion cars in the planet to 8 billion cars, whether it's electric or petroleum, we're destroying the planet. We need to go to much fewer energy source for movement, and that's public transportation. It's ridiculous that in corridors like in the eastern seaboard of the United States, the train service is so poorly developed. It still takes hours to get from New York City to Washington, D.C. A good high-speed rail, you could get there in an hour. Really good, high-quality, high-speed rail. It's beyond people's imagination that something like that is possible. And you shouldn't have to buy a ticket for it. It should be available. Well, what does this book say to the rest of the world? Frankly, if you stop spending $8 trillion on wars and stop bombing and occupying parts of the world, other people can breathe. It's a simple thing the United States can do is end the blockade on Cuba. Actually, the US government would save money if it ended the blockade on Cuba. It spends an inordinate amount of money maintaining that damn blockade. If you end the blockade, use that money to build your own nice train systems and allow the Cubans who have done amazing things with their socialist project under the conditions of the blockade. Imagine if the blockade ends, the things that the Cuban people could do. And by the way, one of the reasons I said it costs so much for the US to maintain that blockade is that there are medical treatments that the Cubans have designed that could be given to the United States government to help the US population. Instead, you are in the grip of a nasty profit-grubbing pharmaceutical and hospital system that is denying you the kind of healthcare you need in a modern world. You end that blockade on Cuba, Cuban medicine, Cuban medical practices can come into the United States, save lives, save social wealth, and improve the general condition of people in the United States. One of the reasons fascists are so angry, in capitalist countries, in India, in Brazil, the Bolsonaristas refusing to concede the election, just like the Trumpists in the United States. One reason the fascists are so angry is that I just feel like conditions of life are so bad for people in these societies. They've been brutalized into anger. There's just insufficient mental health care, insufficient nutritional food, insufficient leisure time. Obviously, people are going to be piss mad. They don't know how to behave properly with each other. Eat better, friends. Go see a therapist. All of those things are available under socialism. Socialism is going to take mental health seriously. You won't be so angry. You won't need to yell at people in grocery stores and so on.
All right, Vijay, preaching over here. All right, this is what I'm talking about. Y'all go get this book. If you ain't got it, get it. So I want to ask just, Vijay, you talked a lot about, care, and just moving into this next round of questions, I really want to talk about, or just really ask, and I'm going to put this first question to Ben. So where I live in South Carolina, if y'all haven't noticed by the accent, I am Southern. In South Carolina, Black people, we are like about roughly 29% of the population, but we're 53% of the people in jail and 60% of the people in prisons. And, most of these crimes are for petty drug offenses, petty thefts, different crime, these things of poverty, as well as results of other traumas, like Vijay mentioned, mental health, etc. So it's easy to see why abolition has become such a more popular term within the last 1 to 2 years, right? We see what people incarcerated are going through. We see the conditions. We see how fast Black people are getting locked up. So can you, Ben, really discuss how the state will shift under socialism to really prioritize community care rather than incarceration?
Yeah, it's a great question. We have a chapter dealing with policing and prisons also in a socialist future, which obviously is a hotly debated issue. It's debated within the left. It became a major point of discussion in the uprisings, which we were all a part of in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. And it's been a big part of bourgeois propaganda for the last 2 years. The whole ideological counteroffensive against the uprising has been that we need to rearm and refund the police, that to basically make a caricature of what the movement was calling for, to make it to spread all the imagery of a massive crime wave, which we've reported in Breakthrough News, for instance, is grossly exaggerated. And it's really often about how the political and media commentators want to present something. If you want to focus 99% of your coverage on the most sensational crimes, you can almost always, at any moment, create the conception that we are in the most dangerous time ever, which is just simply is not true. Even if you want to tell police to go out and prosecute and arrest for a certain kind of crime, and just sort of at your discretion as the commander of the police, you could basically whip up the crime statistics you need that can then be utilized for whichever political program. For instance, sending more of our tax dollars to police and the prisons and away from social services, the things we actually need. So this is an extremely important question, because obviously people do care about safety. People do want to live in safe communities. And it's not that crime is non-existent, and interpersonal violence is obviously real, and thievery and all those other things. So people have the right to ask those questions. But we have to really cut to the heart of it, that what the ruling class is doing is not providing any real solutions. If anything, all their solutions are going to do is just deepen those problems and basically incarcerate more and more people. We wrote a book, Eugene Puryear from the PSR wrote a book called Shackled and Chained, Mass Incarceration in Capitalist America, which talked about the evolution of this prison system. And you really have to understand that to be able to explain what this prison system is, the history. You can't just say it's like there's criminals out there and then the police go and lock them up. And then there's a very neutral statistic of crime statistics, and that indicates sort of the level of crime in society. This is completely wrong. Mass incarceration was developed as a social control, basically a system to deal with the contradictions of capitalism in a period in which the progressive movements were being pushed back in the 1970s, in which the cities were being hollowed out with deindustrialization, deregulation, in which the most progressive and vanguard forces in the Black community, the revolutionary organizations, were being destroyed. This was all a conscious idea to basically intimidate and lock up the communities that were most prone to rebellion and revolution. And so they went and basically invented the crimes, or started basically criminalizing the most basic activities of one's life. And then 3 strike rules, and we know the rest about how this leads to mass incarceration. But it's not a reaction to rising crime that this system has been created. So we talk about the complete dismantling of this mass incarceration system. And we actually go back to this question of abolition. We want to abolish and destroy the social conditions that give rise to crime. And we want to completely abolish the police as we know them, which have been only set up as basically the managers for private property. You know, when you think about the quote need for police, if you go to many suburban areas in the United States, the police have a very low footprint, right? And yet people feel generally safe and stable in a lot of those communities. People leave their doors unlocked in some of them and so forth. So it's not like just having more police makes you feel more safe. In fact, what those communities have generally are the better off communities. So they have education that their kids can rely on. They have jobs. They have a lot of basic things. And that automatically diminishes the amount of quote unquote crime. We also have to recognize what is crime is also completely socially constructed. Wage theft is the biggest crime in the country, but there's no one really going to prison for it. And that could add up to tens of billions of dollars. And yet if you go steal anything at the store, whether it's 50 cents or $500, you can go to jail. So the whole question of what are the crimes that the state chooses to enforce and how they enforce them is always constructed by what is the class program of that state. So yes, we will prosecute certain crimes under socialism, of course, especially the crimes of racism and sexist violence. You know, these things cannot be tolerated. And this will be a fundamental difference from a capitalist rule to a socialist rule. But the overall need for this kind of outside policing forces and the need for mass incarceration will be completely diminished. When you think about it, how many crimes are the products of despair? How many crimes are the product of disempowerment, where people feel they have no power in their life, they have no future, they have no, in their job, in their, when they go to school, in their communities, they're being, you know, intimidated and made to feel inferior and less than. And then they take that out on someone else who's their neighbor or in their family. Many crimes like that are the products of that kind of despair and disempowerment. Then there are crimes of just poverty, that people are committing crimes to make do. I mean, the whole drug industry is basically because, not because people have a great love for doing what they're doing, but because you can actually make way more than you can working in a fast food joint. And so from an economic standpoint, there's a buyer and there's a way to make money, so people are going to do it. But if all these jobs actually paid $30 an hour, and if you had the ability to go to school for free and your transportation was free, as Vijay was saying, and you could zip onto high-speed rail in an hour and get to another city and get a change of pace in your life. If all these things were available, think about how much that would relieve in terms of those sorts of crimes. There is, of course, the need for a state also from the standpoint of counter-revolution, because we do know that in any revolution, it's not like the old ruling class just sort of walks away and says, okay, guys, good idea, we're going to give up all our power and wealth. There's often very significant struggles to retake their lost power and their lost property, to reimpose the system of injustice and exploitation back on the working class, where the 1% can, or the 0.001% can employ another 1 or 2% of the population to basically wage war on the revolution. This book doesn't really deal with that kind of question in detail. The book actually really starts with the period of peace, assuming that we've overcome the period of revolution and counter-revolution, but where we have a period of stability. Of course, there will be vestiges of that. The white supremacist groups that currently are in the United States and have always been here since its founding are not just going to go away. You know, they'll go underground, they'll do this, they'll do that. So we have to have vigilance at all times. Doesn't mean necessarily you need a specially isolated group, but the whole community being empowered. And that's where I'll end my comment here. Vijay spoke about common sense solutions. One of the most important common sense solutions that communities have come up with respect to the scourge of violence in the communities is having violence interruption. This is just one example. Violence interruption, where people who kind of come from the same life, who understand where this violence is coming from, by them being basically community leaders and not just seeing as ex-felons and ex-prisoner, but the people who can actually have an influence on young people, giving them the resources, and they already have the stature, a lot of them in the neighborhood, to be able to intervene at a moment of a crime, before a crime exists, when they can hear it developing, when they can see it coming. This actually has prevented far more murders and serious violent crimes than the police do, who basically stop no crimes, really, and solve very few also. So, imagine if you had a state project to really empower this group of people with huge amounts of resources and organization from the ground up, where the whole neighborhood was behind it. You would feel so much social pressure, and you would feel, you would actually change how you react to others in your neighborhood if your neighborhood were not an occupied zone by foreign police, which are functioning like a military, but you had neighborhood power, and you felt like this was our neighborhood, and you really had made decisions based on political power about what's going to happen in your neighborhood, where there's not development and gentrification that displaces you, where you feel pride in your place. I think all of these things will significantly change the dynamics of quote unquote crime, and will empower communities and the working class itself through its mass organizations to really stop problems before they start. Of course, there will still be problems, and no state can really say we will never confine people at all. We will never remove people at all from the rest of society. There, of course, in a lengthy transition period into socialism, where people still have the habits and the culture of capitalism, we can't say that, that's it. There's just no one will ever be locked up for anything. I think that this is actually kind of a utopian caricature of what people meant when they were saying abolish the police, and what people meant when they said defund the police. What people mean is put the resources that we're devoting to incarceration and to police into care, as you said, into services, into health, into after-school programs, into youth jobs programs, and so forth. Think about all those things that we need to do for energy and transportation. All those things are going to require millions and millions of new jobs, and those are the jobs that can give people a sense of power in a very stark contrast to the capitalist present, where people feel they have no future, and that's really the defining sort of feature of being a young person from the working class in the United States in this era, is feeling like you have no future. And if we don't start a discussion of crime there, we're really just sort of speaking in moral platitudes.
Thank you so much for that, Ben. So Jodi, as we're talking about care and community empowerment, one realm is caregivers. So as someone, I'm a caregiver for, disabled family members. My sister has sickle cell disease, a devastating disease, as well as a child. It's become really, really obvious and prevalent that reproductive labor is not only uncompensated and unrecognized as vital work to make the society run, but it's also caregiving is individualized. So can you talk a little bit about the different ways in which a socialist society caregivers will be more supported?
Yeah, thanks so much, Kym. First, I'll just start with the kind of bottom line. And the bottom line is that in our vision of socialist reconstruction, everyone will have free health care, inclusive of mental and emotional care, as Vijay mentioned. There will be cradle to grave education, low to no cost housing and transportation, and an ample supply of healthy food. So everyone's material needs will be met. This provides caregivers with a kind of fundamental material level of support, something that is missing today and especially burdens people who are caring for sick or disabled loved ones. Like many people today are worrying about negotiating with insurance companies, or with the high cost of drugs, or with trying to find someone help with caring for a family member, right? And then trying to get reimbursed for that expense. And then all these different layers of ridiculous kinds of paperwork and compensation. That's absurd and it's cruel. And so by making sure that this basic material level is support is like the bottom line, that alleviates some kinds of stresses that people who are caring for sick and disabled loved ones have. have. So that's the basic level. Now I want to talk there because you mentioned that how capitalism conceives or misconceives or treats reproductive labor, and I want to talk a little bit more about that because, as you know, capitalism really naturalizes it, which means capitalism assumes that the labor of care just happens, that it's natural, that somehow families just naturally care for their kids, or that women just naturally will care for children, or that it's just that it doesn't even need to be thought about or compensated or addressed. It's just ignored. And this is clearly a myth. We know that. And we can recognize how it's a myth by thinking about a little bit about the history of capitalism. So prior to capitalist industrialization, and even for quite a while afterwards, particularly in areas and countries that weren't industrialized but were themselves treated as resources for capital, but prior to industrialization, most necessary labor, as in labor that meets basic needs, most necessary labor was done at home. It was done domestically. People grew the food that they needed. They made clothes and candles and soap and furniture and other basics, right? These weren't things like clothes and soap and furniture and candles. They weren't mass-produced commodities made by factory workers. They were products of household labor, and often labor that was socialized within the larger community, right? As the whole community participates in various kinds of work and shared responsibilities. So this is prior to capitalist industrialization. With the rise of industry, though, we've got a strong division between domestic labor and waged labor. So some members of the household, we might, the kind of knee-jerk stereotype is that was the men, but actually women and children went into factories, particularly early on. And then in many parts of the world, women and children are a large part of the industrial labor force. So there's kind of a stereotype that's actually never been accurate about factory labor. But anyway, to understand this kind of story of the rise of industrial labor, there's a division between the factory waged labor and labor in the home. So some members of the household become employed in factories and received wages, right? They receive money for this work. And then it also happens to be the case that a lot of the items that were made at home now start to be made in factories, like clothes and candles and canned goods and furniture, right? So the result then is a devaluing of domestic labor. Domestic labor is seen as work that doesn't make money because it doesn't make money for the capitalist and doesn't produce anything of value. It's just work that's done out of love or natural duty and basically becomes sort of substantially disrespected and devalued. So industrialization happens, and with a different, in a kind of combined and uneven way in different parts of the world. And members of the household, many are still working at home, doing the things that have to be done at home, right? And they're not getting paid. They were never paid for it. It's just now other work is paid. So they're continuing to cook and clean and take care of children and take care of family members. They're not getting paid, but the people who are working in the factories are paid. And we should just think this situation persists, right? It's not just a historical fact, right? This is part of our basic reality. We can think about when the Social Security system was created, and it's still the case, like domestic and agricultural labor weren't entitled to benefits. Only wage jobs were actually the kind of jobs by the middle of the 20th century in the US that now were really just going primarily to white men. And so people who are doing all sorts of other labor weren't getting compensated when they could no longer do that work. And then, of course, we can think about the vast amount of work that continues to be done in the domestic sphere. It's basically endless. Lots of times particularly like, washing dishes and cleaning clothes and taking care of small kids. I mean, it can start to feel a lot like drudgery, even though the kind of myth is that it's only and always done out of a sense of care and love. I mean, as if care and love is something free, as if care and love didn't require its own maintenance, as if care and love had no value at all. So capitalism then depends on productive labor, right? Making things that we need to survive. And it depends on reproductive labor, the taking care of people, taking care of relationships, taking care of our common lives. And it's been, for the most part, productive labor that has been waged and reproductive labor that has been assigned to people on the basis of sex and race. Typically, it's understood as women's labor, and when a family can afford it, they usually hire an immigrant woman, a woman of color in the US, a Black woman to do that work. Now, under socialism, this is going to change. We're not going to use the capitalist division of labor to organize work. We're not going to divide labor between owners and workers, town and country, domestic and waged. Instead, we'll recognize that everyone works and that this work contributes to our capacity to reach larger social aims. And we do this with planning, right? With collectively discussing our values, priorities, goals, and our needs. And not just with respect to production, but also with reproduction. I'm going to give some examples. So we can think of, and this isn't like a blueprint, like nothing can change. It's right now, this part's like a thought experiment. But we can think about, as an approach to planning, our work as generally following into like 3 baskets of categories. Specialized, trained, and shared. So if we think about specialized basket, yes, we could think of like complex and highly trained work, like, designing network algorithms or something. It's the kind of work that takes years and years of education, like brain surgery or molecular biology or climate science, right? The kind of work that people have to spend a lot of years learning and studying, and that they generally devote their whole lives to. And that's necessary work, but it's not a whole lot of work. Then we can think of another basket, like trained work. And this would be the sort of work that definitely requires training and education, but not so much that people couldn't change, and actually even now don't change if there's something else that they prefer to do, or something else like under socialism that we think is necessary. So for example, we might think of primary school teaching, right? Some people do that for part of their life, and then another part of their life, they might do something else. We could think of physical therapy or construction or graphic design. All of these are trained kinds of work. All of these require education, but they don't take so many years of education that you can't imagine and can't actually engage in other kinds of work. You can't switch, like people can switch mid-careers. So that's the second basket. And then the third basket we can think of as shared work. And this third category is the kind of work that almost every one of us, virtually everybody has to do at some point in our lives. And that would be cooking, cleaning, laundry, taking care of people and animals and others in our households, right? Everyone does this, right? Or it's not just the case that this is somehow women's work. It's the work that, we know this, even people who live by themselves have to get their food together and eat their meal and get their clothes on in the morning and, take out their trash at some level, feed the cat, right? So this is kind of work that everybody has to do. And there's absolutely no reason that this generally work, one, has to be assigned to certain groups on the basis of sex and race, and 2, can't be shared and collectivized and pooled and planned. So let me just say just a bit more about this. So of course, I bet people are thinking, well, wait a minute, what about these other kinds of jobs that do these other things? It's like, sure, these are just 3 general baskets. There's lots of work that will go in between the different baskets that occupies all the baskets. It's just kind of a thought experiment that breaks us out of the suppositions of a capitalist labor market and breaks us out of the kind of distorted way that thinking in terms of jobs under capitalism, it messes up with our head, right? That approach doesn't let us recognize, wait a minute, no, what work is supposed to be is about how we use our capacities to meet social needs. Right? That's actually why we work, is to try to, let us reproduce and reproduce our common lives together. So we can think about that with these three different baskets of kinds of work, right? Specialized, trained, and shared. And then we can recognize that once we start valuing all these kinds of work, then we're going to be able to figure out how to distribute our labor and be pretty confident that the work of caregivers is going to be much more highly valued and prioritized, because everybody needs it. It's something that everybody does in some parts of our lives. And so it has to be respected and socialized, rather than having caregivers feeling isolated, diminished, and ignored. So I've got to say, I'm excited for socialism. I think socialism is going to let us do things together that capitalism tries to make us do all by ourselves.
No, thank you so much for that, Jodi, and just uplifting all of those just amazing and powerful points. Okay, so Vijay, historically, the United States has sided with those who advance capitalist and imperialist interests globally. Like the Israeli state and its occupation of Palestine, the self-proclaimed president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido. Right now we're on this wave of talking about love and community care. And so how do you envision a socialist government in this vein of love and in this vein of solidarity in the US, building relationships with other nations, and on what grounds?
Well, Marx and Engels, those great old men from the 19th century, wrote in a book that was published many years after their death that, communism, they wrote, is the actual movement of history. I've always liked that line, is the actual movement of history. In fact, let's take a look at the world today. There's a lot of rhetoric about China this, China that, China is going to destroy the world, and, the Chinese are destroying their own people. We don't need to get into all that. Yesterday, at the Chinese Foreign Ministry, the spokesperson made a very interesting comment. He said, China is not interested in world domination. We're not interested in hegemony. We're not interested in being, a pole. We're basically interested in living on the planet Earth. I suppose, in a way, Kym, just going along with that idea that these are common sense proposals, I suppose one should go and read this chapter on ending imperialist wars, which is toward the end of the book, chapter 10. You should read this chapter because it's a pretty straightforward thing. Just imagine you have a government in the United States. Hopefully, this socialist government will dismantle the White House. We don't want a socialist government in something called the White House in the United States. I mean, the racist old White House needs to be made into something else, perhaps a community center for people a drop-in center for people who are trying to get out of problems with drugs and so on. That's a pretty good building for that. The Oval Office is a kind of romper room where you put mats on the ground and people can just sort of lie around. That seems to be what US presidents do anyway. It does feel like a kind of halfway house for insane people who can't find better jobs in Wall Street. The most mediocre people seem to end up there. Anyway, when a socialist government comes to power in the United States, one would hope that all they have to do is to tell the other 190 odd governments in the world, we're open to collaboration. We don't want to come and tell you what to do and impose our will on you. We don't need to use our immense armed force to steal your resources. We want to collaborate. There's a pandemic, let's collaborate. You don't have to listen to a socialist for that. The head of the WHO, sometime in March of 2020, made a very important statement, so common sense. He said, this is the time for collaboration, not confrontation. What did the US government do? Immediately confront the government in Venezuela. Say, we're going to overthrow you. Immediately confront the government in Cuba. We're going to overthrow you. Here's the head of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, who's not some progressive. In fact, he often behaves quite poorly. Mr. Guterres, at the beginning of the pandemic, said there should be an international ceasefire. No more arms, don't provide the Saudis with arms to bomb the Yemenis. Just let's have an international ceasefire. No, the arms companies have to have their profits must be satiated. and there were therefore exports during the pandemic. So what actually is being said here, it's not that there's some, incredible complicated socialist algorithm that needs to be created for foreign policy. Not at all. All you need is a foreign ministry with a foreign minister or a group of ministers, a collective of foreign ministers, I expect, to be out there telling people, we're not going to bomb you. We're going to negotiate with you. It's okay to have a talk with us. Tell us what you actually feel. We'd like to hear your worries and concerns, and then we'll put our worries and concerns forward, and then we'll find a way to deal with each other. That's called diplomacy, by the way. It's quite a simple thing. It's what two reasonable people do when they meet for coffee. One person doesn't show up at the coffee and say, you're an idiot, I don't agree with you, you got to listen to me. That's how the US government behaves, and has behaved for 200 years, because next year is the 200th anniversary of the global Monroe Doctrine. So I would imagine if people read chapter 10 here, it's pretty straightforward. Cut back on your arms spending, don't waste your money on that, and actually take diplomacy seriously. Let me tell you an interesting thing I discovered, Kym, when I was reading the WikiLeaks cables, particularly from Egypt and Yemen and so on. What I found so bizarre, and very little remarked upon, is that these highly skilled US ambassadors would be sent to Pakistan and in Egypt. In both cases, senior women from the diplomatic corps in Pakistan and in Egypt. These are the women who were ambassadors while the WikiLeaks cable thing was going on. Well, they write in their cables back to Washington saying that, we continuously get sidelined by the generals. The generals show up in Cairo, the generals show up in Islamabad, and they do diplomacy. These two senior women, are basically not taken seriously. Well, a socialist government is not going to send the generals to other countries to make foreign relations. You're going to do it through the civilians. People don't know this, but the United States civilian diplomatic structure is subordinated to the military structure. Antony Blinken works alongside Lloyd Austin. Lloyd Austin, who was a sitting general, doesn't actually subordinate himself to the kind of civilian wing of foreign policy. It's the other way around. Well, the socialists would turn that around. I just want to make one more point, by the way, about something Jodi was saying earlier. This is a great book, guys. Highly congratulate you. Everybody should read it. But this book ends in a way where the next stage of socialism begins. And I want to put this directly to people. Socialism is not about work. Socialism is about leisure. Socialism is about everything that happens after we've figured out how to make life reproduce itself one way or the other. There's a terrific comment that comes in an early chapter where it says a teacher works for 20 hours and for part of the remainder of the time does community work, gathers together with other members of his or her neighborhood to maybe work in a drop-in shelter for kids, who are bored and want to come and play or whatever, play chess with them. It's a kind of volunteer work. But then there's also time for you to get involved in politics. There's time for you to go home, relax, talk to your kids. You see, what's happened in what capitalism does is capitalism does something interestingly contradictory. It destroys leisure so that people just come home exhausted, unable to, don't have the time to do things, don't have the bandwidth and energy to do anything. So capitalism assassinates leisure, and then it provides for you, this is the contradiction, a way for you to absorb leisure passively. Get into your couch, lie in bed, pick up your iPad or your device and watch a Netflix series by yourself. This is reality that's beginning to look like the film WALL-E. In fact, this is not leisure. Leisure is where you do things with other people. This is a kind of surrender from society. So capitalism both destroys leisure, it assassinates leisure, and then it provides you this thing which in one way or the other looks like leisure, which is, what, guys, don't bother me now. I'm going to watch my Netflix serial, a form of a narcotic, a kind of cultural narcotic. It's no longer social kind of leisure. And I think what this book suggests to us is the next chapter is going to be on what socialist life is going to be like, which is large sections of time to spend with your family, your community, your friends, people you love, people you may not love, that is to say, doing politics. That's what most of your life should be spent on. Right now, people who work wait for their retirement to start to live. I think what socialism says is you have to live while you're alive, not suspend living to the period after retirement. That is a ridiculous way to understand human life. Today, hundreds of millions, billions of people who are employed in one way or the other have suspended life, saying, I dream of a time when I can retire and then I will have a social life. That is just ridiculous. That is ridiculous. This plan is a full frontal attack at that assassination of leisure.
Thank you, Vijay. Thank you. You keep taking me to church tonight, Vijay. I can't handle it. It's not even Sunday. And thank you so much.
That's because under socialism, Kym, every day will be Sunday.
There we go. That's what I'm talking about. I'm trying to have Sabbath every day of the week. So thank y'all so much. And just right now, Vijay, I'm about to put you to work because you're doing such a great job anyway. Just in the spirit of collectivity and solidarity, I'm going to give you a job. Just given your work with political organizations just all over the world, and your work as a journalist, I really want to invite you to ask the contributors questions. Just ask Jodi and Ben some questions.
Well, guys, like I read this book. I read it on the plane, actually, leaving the great historical victory of Lula winning the election, and thinking, what will Lula be able to accomplish in the next period in that country? One of the issues, I don't mean to say that a book like this shouldn't be there. It should be read by everybody. One of the things I think I'd like the two of you to reflect on, because you were part of the team that produced the book, is having imagined the future, which is really hard enough to do. What are some of the immediate obstacles to building towards that future? In other words, what's the program to get there?
Want to go, Ben, or do you want me to?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so I think that the program for getting there is actually, is building the party, building organization, and changing consciousness. That's a fairly typical left answer, but I think that's because we don't get beyond that, right? It's not going to be a magic wand. It's not going to be like all of a sudden, magically, the Party for Socialism and Liberation has 50 million people. It's not going to be magically that tomorrow morning after this fantastic webinar, everybody wakes up and the socialist, consciousness sprinkles are in their brains and everything's fine, right? This part is hard work. But I think that that hard work is also the inspiring, fulfilling, meaningful, important work of being involved in politics, and actually that's the actuality of communism. You were mentioning earlier, Vijay. You mentioned Lula, and I was thinking, gosh, it's not really just on him, right? Right? It's on the people. It's like, what will the people do? How will all of the different mass organizations? How will they organize? How will they work to, basically to keep pushing him left, to keep pushing the country left, to protect the Amazon, to solve the social problems? And it's always going to be a collective project. And I want to add one last thing. I'm really glad you mentioned the issue of leisure time, because the one of the kind of fundamental sets of values in the book is that we are the vision of socialism emphasizes universal basic services, like we've talked about with respect to healthcare and education and sort of organizing domestic life and transportation and housing. So universal basic services, meaningful work, where work isn't just understood in terms of whether or not it's waged and how much money it gets, but is it part of the active reorganization of society and the active building of socialism, the active adaptation of our infrastructure in ways that responds to climate change, the active building of solidarities around the world. So we've got universal basic services and meaningful work. And then the third prong is more free time, right? We emphasize throughout the book that, when more people are actually doing the work that matters, we're all going to have a lot more free time. And that free time is going to be meaningful, substantial free time, not the BS time of, that we come out when we're exhausted and spent at the end of a day of pretty much ridiculous drudgery. So I think that what's pretty exciting is that we have a vision of socialism that's widely shared. And like you said from the beginning, it's common sense. It comes from centuries of the struggle of working and oppressed people. And what do working and oppressed people want? More free time. Right? They want their work to be meaningful, which means things that we want to do, not that someone is making us do, but we want to do because we see that it's meaningful and important for our communities. And we want the basic services that let all of us, work together and have a viable life that can thrive.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that the book doesn't answer the $1 million question of tactics and strategy. That's why we need organizations, because tactics and strategies have to be formulated based on things that are happening right now. And they have to be, the class struggle is like that. It can't be, you can't write a book and hope that people follow the book as an answer for the tactics of organization and how to respond to this or that issue. I think that, we are heading into, it's not me, the party's assessment of a highly explosive moment in US politics. And it seems somewhat calm right now. Maybe, there's it's not 35 million people in the streets like the summer of 2020, but that's going to happen again. And that's going to happen with actually greater frequency. And even, I would say, even on a bigger scale in the years to come. And we can remember how that impacted consciousness. People started raising radical slogans and envisioning a different way to prioritize resources and started making demands. Even Joe Biden adopted a somewhat left-wing domestic program for a few months. That was the anger and demands of the masses. Of course, he dropped it as quickly as he could, and his party itself sort of gutted that program, where we're talking about universal childcare and actually relieving student debt and all sorts of other things that were just left at the wayside. But ultimately, it's the struggle itself which is going to produce the mass interest in radical politics and radical programs. But we can't come up with those in the moment, right? We have to come up with those, and some of them will come up in the moment, but a lot have to be developed in advance. And our goal is to try to win a majority of the working class to socialism explicitly. Because if we just are in the struggle and then people say, hey, you're a really good organizer, and you say, yeah, I'm glad you're working with me. How about, socialist revolution? It's a big jump because they've already heard all these other things about socialist revolution. So we have to be able to win people to the idea of socialism as we're organizing in the ongoing struggles. We can't do it in a dogmatic way where we say the answer to every problem is socialism and socialism is our only demand and so forth. But as people begin to move, they begin to question things. And there's always time to take a few seconds, take a few minutes, organize a meeting or a study group to really think about big picture politics. We named the book Reconstruction, Socialist Reconstruction, for a reason, because this country has seen highly explosive, turbulent times before. And the history of Reconstruction is one where the formerly enslaved really led the way in a lot of areas in trying to recreate society in the ashes of the old. And so there is a radical revolutionary history that we also need to study here. So organizing and studying, it all has to go together. But the 2024 elections, could become the site of a serious, almost pre-revolutionary crisis in the United States. And that might seem far off because we're 2 years away and because there's not 35 million people in the streets. But for instance, if the Republican Party succeeds at overthrowing the popular vote at the state level and allowing independent state legislatures to pick the electors regardless of how people vote, and that's what is going to be discussed in the Supreme Court in Moore v. Harper. Dobbs was a shot at people's right to body autonomy. That took away abortion, but it's going to be affirmative action. It's going to be voting rights. It's going to be how even the electors are chosen for the Electoral College. We're heading into extremely turbulent, explosive times, and it's really about being organized and not leaving it to, for instance, the Democratic Party or anyone else to to like save democracy or save our rights. That's not going to happen. It's going to require the people themselves feeling collectively as the agents of history to be able to defend our rights. And in fact, not just defend, but fight for something new, because the level of rights that we had were quite impoverished already. And in fact, we have to really have a new battle for democracy, a battle for true democracy, not just a battle for hollow democracy where you only get to vote every 2 to 4 years over who will exploit you, but democracy where you're controlling the decisions about your neighborhood, about your workplace, democracy that includes, as you say, making all the things that we need to survive available, not just affordable, available. Thank you. Thank you, Vijay. Great question.
Nice. Thank y'all so much. Just thank y'all again for joining us. We have a few more minutes. Vijay, if you could just answer one more question. How do you see this book intervening in the ideological battle in our current context?
Well, many years ago, and most of the people on this webinar may not have been born then, Fidel Castro made a speech where he said, that's in the ashes of the Soviet Union, he said that we are entering a period of the battle of ideas. You might remember, those who were around then, in the 1990s, there was a concerted effort to disparage and delegitimize the Soviet experiment. I mean, it's pretty incredible. The Soviet Union lasted about 7 decades. That's about less than the average lifespan of a human being. And yet, within a few years of the Soviet experiment, just to take one arena of life, they, legalized abortion. They said that men and women both have entitlement to inheritance. They allowed for no-fault marriage. They had women voting. I mean, think about the amazing rights that women were able to seize in the early years of the Russian Revolution. And for good reason. We know that the February Revolution began on International Women's Day because women workers went out on the street. There were amazing achievements of the Soviet experiment, but in the 1990s, it was essentially criminalized to talk favorably about anything to do with socialism. They were able to deepen what Ben said, this idea that the unofficial religion of the United States, it's actually all over the first chapter in the book, is anti-communism. They were able to deepen this even more in the 1990s. Entire generation came that were disgruntled with things in the United States were only able to achieve an anti-capitalist consciousness. They were anti-capitalist, even anti-state. Some anarchist ideas were there, but anti-capitalism was the horizon. It was very difficult for people to say, well, there's something that comes beyond that, something called socialism. I think what this book is doing, not only in the United States, but in different parts of the world as well, is being part of this battle of ideas process to move us from an anti-capitalist ceiling to say, no, above your head, there's another floor. And that floor is called socialism. I mean, this is a very difficult battle. I think this idea of anti-communism being the unofficial religion in the United States, it's not just in the United States, it's in Canada, it's in very many parts of the world. We're going to have to deal with this. If we want to advance our struggles beyond anti-capitalism, we have to be able to suggest an exit from the wretchedness of this system. And this book is a contribution to that. Obviously, it doesn't answer the question or solve anything, etc. It's a contribution. I highly recommend that people read it, that they hold study groups around it, that they take the arguments from it into their movements, accompany their movements with some of these arguments, attempting to shift us from the ceiling of anti-capitalism to the floor of socialism. I think for me, that is the great contribution that this book has made. And for that, again, I've said it a few times, but congratulations.
That's so awesome, Vijay. I just wanted to jump in and say thank you so much for that. And particularly because the breaking the ceiling of anti-capitalism as that's the only thing that can be said or imagined. I kind of think of this book as as like a weapon, right? In that, like dreams can be weapons in the hand of the working class, in the hands of oppressed people. A vision of a better world has really material force and material power. And visions of our future are too important to be left in the hands of the capitalist and capitalist media and capitalist escapism, right? They have to be part of our horizon of struggle so that we know what we're fighting for, and we know that a much better, radically different world is actually possible.
Thank you so much for that, Jodi, and thank you so much for that response, BJ. We're at the end of our amazing discussion. I thank y'all so much, Ben, Jodi, BJ. Thank you so much for joining us and just being in this conversation with me. I wish we were live and in person so I could give y'all big hugs and fist bumps, because this is an amazing book and this is an amazing moment in history. And I'm just so honored to have been in this conversation with y'all. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you, Kym. Have a good night, comrades, friends.
Thanks a lot. Bye. See
Get the
you.
book. Buy the book.
Buy the book. Make sure you buy the book.
Thanks, comrades.